Welcome back, everybody, to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. It's great to have you back with us to finish off our conversation with the remarkable Peter Jennings, who's got all of the credentials to have a meaningful conversation with us, and none more important right now in the context of dealing with a world for Australia that is so dominated by this dynamic between the US and China, but in particular now the complications of what's the reliability of our US ally? What direction are they likely to go in under Donald Trump? But more unpacking, well, what does that mean in terms of the actual nature of China's direction? How serious is this threat? Well, how concerned should we be? What exactly are their ambitions, and how would we counter it? What would we do about it? What could we meaningfully do in relation to this? So thanks for being back with us, Peter.
My pleasure.
And just sort of building on where we finished last time, Xi, as he came into supreme authority around that 2012 time period, and he started laying out his agendas, and he flagged that he wanted to be the master of technology, and I think they've poured about $1.4 trillion into this, really surging on quantum computing, for example, trying to encourage the diaspora of Chinese scientists to come home, building a whole university dedicated, and saying that this was like the ring in the bull of the nose that he wanted to be holding. Okay, so that's one thing. He wants to put China on the front foot, being the dominant economic world power. But to what extent should we be concerned about aggression in a more, military form? What are their intentions in your view?
So we should be concerned because we've seen, certainly in the last 10 or 15 years, the build-up of a truly remarkable level of military capability inside the PLA. Xi has completely transformed it from being, the mass people's army, more or less focused on imposing domestic stability across the country, to being a smaller but still very large, high-tech force with increasingly long-range power projection capabilities, a very strong navy, a very powerful long-range missile force and air force. Now, of course, the point is they don't necessarily have to use those military capabilities. And I think Xi is enough of a scholar of Chinese strategic thinking, Sun Tzu, to understand that, any smart general would rather take their objectives peaceably than by using military force.
Right.
But what Xi's doing is he's building the capacity to use military force. And I think the clearest demonstration of that was China's rapid annexation of about 80% of the South China Sea,
right,
which really took place between 2014 and 2016 by artificially constructing islands on which airstrips were built and on which seaports were established, ignoring the competing claims to sovereignty which countries in Southeast Asia had.
And the tribunal law of the sea.
Ignoring the law of the sea. There's a lot of deep strategic thinking going on there, because I think, the reason Japan lost the Second World War was because it didn't have sufficient air power down south to defeat the American Navy. And that's what China is trying to give itself through its annexation of the islands of the South China Sea. Yeah. I think if you were to say to me, what are Xi's goals? Number one, it's to stay personally in power. And number two, it's to keep the Communist Party in power in China, because that guarantees goal number one. And then number three is to reestablish China's greatness, because that's the thing which sustains popular support for the Communist Party, which sustains support for Xi Jinping. So it's ultimately all about control. And I think reasserting what the Communist Party sees as a traditionally dominant role for China, at least in the Indo-Pacific region, through Southeast Asia, through North Asia, the Pacific region, but in fact, if not really more broadly across the globe. And I don't think Xi will hesitate to use military force if he thinks it advances any of those goals, the strong China, the strong party, and his place at the centre of all of it.
Right. So I guess it comes back to your point about the timeline for Xi, wanting to get this done within a certain time frame. And I guess, the Chinese game of Wei Qi sort of is a different way of thinking than our sort of traditional game of chess, where we think of the king as the sort of center of gravity, and they have, 140 odd counters each player, and it's all about outmaneuvering and slow strangulation. And I often think that the Chinese strategic policy thinking is kind of shaped by that, to understand that you need to build all these pressure points, to your point about Sun Tzu, to get that goal peacefully if you can. I don't think he really, it'd be interesting your comment is, I don't think he really cares about how much the human cost would be to recover Taiwan. But what would scare him is that he might fail, that it might not be achievable. That'd be the only thing really that would stop him. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah.
Well, fear of defeat is the thing that would stop him, because I think if China attempts to launch an attack to control Taiwan and is defeated, that's definitely the end of Xi, and it may even be the end of the Communist Party.
Right.
So he's only going to do it if he feels he's got a very high level of confidence of success. They're not concerned about human casualties or physical damage. There is almost a sense of Chinese pride that, a bit like the Russians, we know how to suffer.
Right.
We can take a lot more casualties than you, Westerners can take.
Only 1.39 billion people left
to
go, so we've got a lot of way
exactly
through here.
right. And so half a million killed. I don't think that creates a problem. Now, of course, Chinese families might think about that rather differently. That all those one-child families probably don't want to see their children die. But nevertheless, I've never met a person from the mainland of China that didn't passionately support the idea that Taiwan is ours and we're going to take it over.
Right. Does that go back to this? I've often had a sense that the Chinese people are really bought into that, I guess, Chinese chauvinism, and quite rightly very proud of their civilizational history and who they are, and not having that sort of respect and recognition in the world for that superior culture as they might see it, and thinking, well, this pushes our buttons. We, okay, communism, whatever, but, seeing the success of China, seeing, the restoration of a unified China, that might appeal to quite a large number of Chinese.
So I think there's a deep historical neuralgia about a fear of the Chinese state breaking up, which goes back to the Warring States period. The sort of the sense of things can implode, and let's face it, that's what Chinese history tells you. Yes. Is that pretty much every second generation these things do break up. So there's a fear of that. And that means tactically or strategically, the plan is consolidate the periphery. So, 1950, they go into Tibet to control Tibet. They consolidate their hold of Xinjiang and the western provinces. They attempted in the same era to cement their control over the Korean Peninsula and only managed half of that. They've had fights with India. They've had fights with Vietnam. So, one should also mention a deep sense of Chinese unhappiness still at what they think is an unfair treaty that ceded something like 600,000 square kilometers of territory to the Russians in 1857.
Right.
And that's a bit of unfinished business that is still on the minds of a lot of Chinese people. So I think part of the Taiwan thing, apart from it just demonstrates how big and strong we are, is we must control our periphery,
right?
Because that reduces the chance of the centre breaking up under stress. Now, I mean, the interesting thing is pretty much for 100 years, well, since the communist takeover, but every leader before Xi took the view on Taiwan, we can leave this to later generations. We've got bigger fish to fry. We've got to worry about building up our own economy. Xi Jinping changed that. He's the guy that says we can't leave this to the future. It has to be resolved. And I think that does come back to his own mortality. As we said in the last episode, he's 72. He looks fairly healthy. He's like me, a little overweight, I guess, but broadly speaking, he's probably got at least 10 years.
Looks healthier than Donald Trump.
As long as his brain holds out. And, and younger than Donald Trump. But I think he wants this to happen on his patch. And the one thing that would prevent it is if he comes to the judgment that it's going to be too difficult, that there's going to be too much opposition, the Americans will stop it, the Japanese and the Australians and others will join in. He's not on a suicide mission. But on the other hand, the way he sees the world, he sees the West in terminal decline. He thinks there's a major opportunity in the pretty short term, and he's giving himself every opportunity to grab that chance.
Right, and that's a critical point. This belief in the decline of the West, which is an actual objective, and brings me to this current relationship dynamic that we have. What I've referred to as the rectangle of rat bags, with Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. I include North Korea in there because of their capabilities and nuclear and otherwise, which have been so instrumental in keeping Russia in the field, etc. And the nature of that regime and how it's focused a lot on its cyber capabilities as a way of earning revenue, etc. And the lessons they all learned from the Russian activities in information warfare, particularly seeing the results of the US elections in 2016, which the Russians were heavily involved in trying to manipulate, and sort of looking at that asymmetric Sun Tzu type lesson learned out of that you may not be able to spend as much as you want to, or if you want to save money from spending on that catch-up or takeover phase, which is a Chinese phrase that they use there, catch up and overtake. But this can maybe achieve your goals without even having to do any of that. And so you've got, it looks like a very coordinated alignment of information warfare going on, which is all about that undermining of Western society from within, and then painting democracy as a failure and as corrupt and degenerate, etc., and old colonial white boys club stuff. And they've been very coordinating in that message that they've been communicating with the developing world as well, and to keep their own population happy by saying, well, it's not better over the hill. So what strategy do you think China would like to see out of that in its relationship with these other countries? Is this something that's really transactional? How serious should we take that alignment? Where is it going?
It's transactional, but we should take it seriously, because I've never seen over my career China and Russia more effectively working together than they are now. And they certainly understand that whatever their potential differences are, whatever their long-term strategic points of contention, that they get much more benefit by cooperating together now. I think for China in particular, as the kind of most powerful central driver of the rectangle of rat bags, which is a term I've just loved, they understand that what it does is that it spreads the challenge for the democracies to have to deal with in ways which means that the Americans can't, for example, just decide to concentrate all their forces in the Pacific to deal with China. They have to be interested in Europe because of Russia. The Americans have to be interested in the Middle East because of Iran.
And the resources they have to put into that as well.
And that takes resources and time. It was very revealing, because at the end of June there was discussions that took place between the EU and senior Chinese leadership. I think it was Yang Yi, the foreign minister, who, in a remarkably frank discussion with Ursula von der Leyen, who's the EU commissioner, sort of said, well, it's actually in our interests for the Russia-Ukraine war to keep going, because it means that America's got to be focused on that. And you can't just divert your energies towards dealing with China. So now we know. Now we know why China is so actively helping Russia to do damage in Ukraine. And I think now we know why China is quite happy to see Iran, up until just recently, try to progress a nuclear weapons program. And why North Korea, which is often regarded as a sort of a bothersome younger brother in Beijing, why North Korea is being given free rein to provide ammunition and people, for goodness sake, as cannon fodder for the Russians to use in Ukraine. So this has been a very sophisticated move on the part of China to kind of mount a coalition operation against us. We like to think we're the coalition people that can work together. They're doing a pretty good job of that. And it's
for the others, it's kind of how you get around sanctions regimes too.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, the other point I'd make is that you're very right to point to the global south as being an area where Russia and China have both made more gains than I think most democracies realize. Why, for example, is Indonesia got a bromance going between President Subianto and Vladimir Putin? That's big because there's a lot of sympathy for Russia in Indonesia. I don't know that Australians have their minds across that. And so China, they're not making much headway in dealing with the Europeans, for example, or the Americans. But they're doing a lot to get key global South countries on side too. So this should be a worry for the West, for the democracies. I think we too often think that we can rely on democratic niceness and the attractiveness of democratic living standards to kind of say, well, we've got the best model for the world. There's an awful lot of the developing world that does not think that anymore.
Yeah. Just on finish on that sort of alliance discussion, we've had this year the Iran short-term 12-day campaign that was aimed specifically at the nuclear capability, which we know they were seriously pursuing. And there's a lot of Russian and North Korean and Chinese involvement in Iranian military capability. And certainly it's been beneficial two ways for Russia in getting hold of Iranian drones and production of drones, so the strike drones that they use, the Shahed and whatnot. But and the ballistic missile technology, which has given them that ability to do the long-range strike on Israel, and we've seen the impact of that, and you can't filter all of it out, as we've seen. But we know there's Chinese activity at Isfahan, for example. They're there in that mix. They buy 90% of Iran's oil and that sort of stuff. But it seemed to me that both Russia and China were not particularly keen to see Iran get to a nuclear weapon and not that fussed about maybe preventing them. Would that be your take on it, or do you think it's really that they didn't feel they just didn't have an answer to how to stop the West from prioritizing this now militarily through Trump and Israel?
Yeah, I mean, the nuclear program was Iran's goal. And even there, I think Iran was quite happy to sort of be in that grey zone between just having the constituent parts versus actually having the weapon. And it gets very cloudy when the sort of closer the closer you get to that point. But that was what the Iranians wanted, and that was all about helping them achieve their manifest destiny to be the dominant player in the Middle East. What China wanted was, I think, the ability to distract the Americans in the Middle East. It wants the resources that it can get from Iran. But I think what's interesting that's come out of the so-called 12-day war is that neither Russia's probably not in a position to do anything at this point, but certainly China was. They didn't like the regime so much that they were going to intervene to decisively help it. And so if we'd come to a point where the mullahs were about to fall, which regrettably it doesn't look like we're at that point.
Not yet.
I think
sure.
I think China would have been quite happy just to say, well, so long, guys, that's been fun. And then they'd wait to see what emerged from the wreckage. Well, okay, can we deal with this lot? I mean, let's face it, they've no scruples. They'll deal with anyone. They'll engage with the Taliban in Afghanistan if they think they'll get value from it. And so I think that more than anything, what China wanted and continues to want from Russia and Iran and North Korea is just make it costly for the Americans, right? That's what we like you guys to do,
right?
And so far they are.
Give us some. I guess they can rent some more Weiqi counters to threaten with pressure, with the threat of pressure, like Straits of Hormuz and terrorism and the rest of it, and that maybe we could have an influence and be helpful to prevent that from happening. So you give us back Taiwan.
That's right. And notice, in no location do you ever hear China saying we will expend our own blood and money to stabilize anything. Right. So they haven't got in to stabilize Afghanistan. They won't go in to stabilize Iran. They'll bleed the Americans dry on all of these things as much as they possibly can, because they know that weakens them against the moment that Xi might choose to use military force in the Pacific.
Right. Well, then to bring it back to like our immediate security interests and the nature of the threat that China may or may not pose, and this, of course, is the challenge, right? If we're dependent on one man's state of mind, it depends on his mental health, and then there's a question of what happens after him. And I might come back to that. Does he have a succession plan in mind? Is this going to be a family dynasty? But when we see what's going on in the South China Seas, that brings also the potential for us, Australia, to be brought under the range of a lot of their ballistic missile capability, and they've just unveiled another one which will basically really cover our entire continent. But there's a question of how much volume are we talking about here if we're just talking high explosive rather than nuclear. So is this a threat that just amounts to pressure, perhaps like the threat of closing our sea lanes, not necessarily related to potential invasion, etc.? Is it just waving a big stick to sort of coerce us into their policy and aligning us, or is it a serious military threat to us directly, or is it just about Taiwan?
So this question reminds me a little bit about the discussions that Australian strategists might have been having in the sort of early 1940s. Does Japan really have the capacity to invade us, or is it just going to sort of threaten us from the peripheries around us? And of course, no one knew precisely at that time, and we all worked on the worst case scenario. Subsequently, historians concluded that Japan was perhaps at the end of its logistics supply capabilities, and maybe a real invasion was not a possibility. But gosh, it sure looked that way in early 1942.
Yes, wake up.
Now, China is vastly more powerful than Japan.
Yep.
Vastly more powerful. And so I don't think one can say, well, it's absurd to say that there would ever be a situation where they would want to use military force against us, or military force on the Australian mainland. It'll all come down to the calculation of their interests at the time. It's very clear that they can use that to coerce us, and frankly, they're succeeding. So, Mike, if you said to me, go back 10 years and tell me what China's objectives would be for Australia now. Well, I can tell you, China's objectives for Australia would be that we would have significantly reduced military capabilities, that we would have a weaker alliance relationship with the United States, and that we would be more economically dependent on China. And China has achieved all three of those objectives, or we have achieved all three of those objectives, actually. Which kind of explains why Xi Jinping is prepared to cancel his diary in the afternoon to have lunch with Anthony Albanese. I can't believe it's for the glittering conversation.
As opposed to the way Trump's dealing with Albanese.
it's because they think, wow, we are doing so well. And frankly, it didn't look that great from a Chinese perspective in terms of their bilateral interests with us 2 or 3 years ago. So I think I think our current government is making terrible mistakes in terms of too much China and not enough United States.
Mm.
And on the US front, I mean, I completely accept Trump. Trump is difficult, right? He's not,
Just a bit unpredictable, right?
He's exceptionally unpredictable,
Mm.
knowingly so. Like that's part of the game plan, right? This is how he operates. But at the risk of being sort of marched off the campus once we finish our discussion, there are aspects of Trump's policies which I quite like. I mean, I think that I wouldn't have hired Elon Musk to do it, but they need to cut costs. They need to reduce their debt. Their strategy of getting rid of illegal immigrants into the US is rough. It's hard, but it's necessary. It's effective. I think they're doing good things there.
It's interesting to me. It's sort of I think of Trump as like the broken clock that's right twice a day.
Yeah.
So the Abraham Accords and those sort of initiatives were actually a positive. And I think when he's applying this tariff big stick to China, it's only what China did to us, to Australia.
Yes.
In that COVID context, maybe it will bring some lessons home to the Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, for people that like policy, like you and I, it's just in many ways a horror show to watch the craziness of it all. But Trump is in some respects, and I've used this analogy elsewhere, a bit like chemotherapy. America had some serious problems.
It's going to make my hair fall out.
No one takes chemo because they want to, right?
No,
but
have to.
So I think he's actually so far I think he's doing okay. I will say I think many Asian countries are pretty happy with him, and certainly a lot of Middle Eastern countries are happy with him. So Trump is not as on the nose in many other parts of the world as he is in terms of Australian popular responses to him. And I think our government just needs to grow up a little bit and accept that it's not about playing this for domestic political effect. I mean, for goodness sake, Albanese's won the election astonishingly well. So he doesn't need to play those games anymore, but he has an alliance to manage in Washington, D.C., and he's not doing that.
Right. Well, I guess just to finish off for now, because obviously there's going to be a lot more to talk about as all of this unravels or unfolds, depending on how you look at it. But coming back to Xi and where we're going to go from here, does he look at, he's obviously now harking back to his father and rehabilitation, and is he looking to establish a familial dynasty, or does he care about that? It's mainly just about him, so he doesn't mind so much about that. It's really about cementing the Communist Party. And, if he does pursue this kind of dynasty concept, how will that go down in China? I mean, will there be elements that will, and can they, given the nature of the police regime you have there, and the technology that they were applying to that, how do we see that kind of panning out in China's political landscape?
It's just such a fascinating question, and no clear answers. In North Korea, for example, Kim Jong-un has kind of revealed to the population in the last few years his daughter, who's probably about 13 or 14, and she does look to be the next of the Kim family dynasty. He's sort of grooming the country and the daughter for that. There's no clarity about who in Xi's family, firstly, what the extent of it is, and who, if any, might be being brought forward. So I think that his focus, at least for the next 10 or 15 years, is about his personal power. What I think is interesting is that it's a little bit like the Republicans and the MAGA movement. So far, the Communist Party in China has kind of acquiesced to the Xi juggernaut as being the thing that's driving them. But when you pry under the bonnet, what you see is that Xi's made a lot of mistakes. The economy is looking very bad. A lot of the signature reforms, Belt and Road, have not worked. They've actually created huge debt in China. The Communist Party continues to struggle with the impossibility of having innovative, successful companies, but wanting them to be under the thumb of the party at every possible turn. That just seems to be an impossible balance to strike. So there's lots of domestic challenges, and they probably occupy about 90% of his headspace in terms of what he's thinking about day to day. I think the risk is that conflict becomes a way of sort of harnessing the nationalist support of the Chinese people when the party has failed to deliver to them in terms of economic growth. And as for the succession, I think what will basically, the things we should be looking for rather than what's identifiable is, will he find a successor? Whether it's a personal successor or some chosen individual inside the party, or will we see the party go back to a more traditional function, which is to kind of act as a vehicle for balancing different debates and tendencies and ideas about how China should be managed? Will there be people inside the party prepared to stand up to Xi as he gets older and as his mistakes start to look a bit more obvious? I just don't have an answer to those questions, but I think they're the things that, if you're looking at China in an analytical way, you should sort of have your eye on to see what's going to emerge.
Yes, it's, I guess, right now the crystal ball's fairly opaque, and we don't have sort of good lines of sight into some of those internal dynamics.
They're a hard intelligence target still. And we don't even know, for example, why did China decide to move from wolf warrior aggression to being nice to Australia?
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk to people in DFAT, they'd like to tell you it's the quality of their diplomacy, but I'm here to tell you it's not. They have no idea. It's just there was a decision that was taken somewhere inside Beihai that we don't know about, we don't have access to. We don't know what's going on in the heads of the Chinese leadership.
Right. And it is a shame, I think we all felt that, the tradition of kind of Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai, that there was kind of like this trajectory of very slow progression. They were experimenting with village democracy. They were opening up internationally. They supported the rule-based order because it was in their interests, to maintain their sovereignty, and to stop interference. And all of these things were, and, large numbers of Chinese students, coming to our countries, and, and in that sense too, maintaining the one country, two systems process that was going on with Hong Kong. Had they made that look appealing and successful, they might have actually encouraged the Taiwanese to look at coming back on board. But the heavy hand that they showed there just put an end to any Taiwanese interest in that.
We all should have spent more time in our late teens reading Marx, Lenin and Stalin, because that would have told us, in a weird way as I did, but that's another story, that would have told us that was an illusion, that the communists were not going to turn into Democrats. The communists just became more communist, or actually more Leninist. And we got that wrong, just as the Europeans got it wrong that more cooperation with the Soviets or the Russians would make them more like us.
So disheartening. Well, they're just falling back now into that incredibly doctrinaire, almost like a religious cult sort of syndrome, and the cult of personality when it comes to Xi. So look, thanks so much for helping unpack that with us, Peter. There's so much more to cover, and we'll need to keep returning to this. It's the number one dynamic for us to be concerned about in Australia. How do we manage it? How do we maybe try and steer China into at least peaceful paths and remove that threat that's hanging over the region and the world? But for now, thank you so much, Peter. It was great to have you back.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for being with us. It's really important to try and spread the knowledge and understanding of what's going on in our world so that we can also engage with our own political representatives, apply pressure where it needs to be applied in relation to either security or political or diplomatic measures that should be engaged in. So tell your friends, this is the place you come to find out, what it all means. How do we get here? And don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time on Frontlines and Faultlines. Cheers.